can see this talk, quasi-exile as a condition, initially was a response to a migration study question because there was a special issue calling for, dismantling categories. So I was trying to think. Then this new group of people that I'm very interested in, which I call them quasi-exile, is exactly this kind of group which you cannot really capture it by a legal category because, this is a group of people who decided to leave their home country and migrate to a different country based on value-based. Basically, it's kind of value-based migration. So they're not technically political asylum seekers or refugees, but they share some similar existential condition as exile, especially you probably all know in literature, there are many great writers who all had a period of being in exile. So many of these, what I broadly call them content creators, because writers, journalists, artists, documentary filmmakers experience this kind of exile condition. But legally, they enter these countries in different type of visa, like freelancing visa in the Berlin context, right? Or some younger folks might enter through student visas, and so basically you cannot really capture this group through these legal categories of migrants. But then it comes back to this age-old question in migration study that all these categories are a version of migration governance. So we probably don't need to understand individual experience, especially what we care about, these more experiential or existential conditions through their migration categories. So this is why I want to invite us to focus on quasi-exile as a condition. Although the empirical part of this talk more or less focus on the Chinese context, especially about this post-COVID situation, but the larger context, which I believe is more a global thing, that people are leaving supposedly more authoritarian context and trying to move to a place that they believe potentially that they will have more freedom or liberty, and then they encounter new issues. So that's why I titled today's talk After Running from Post-COVID-19 China, because there are a lot of process in this condition, but then there's also lots of new possibilities and challenges after you make this position, a decision to leave. But I want to pull us back a little bit on this old episode of, I guess, looking through everyone in the room, you must all have experienced certain versions of COVID lockdown. So the protagonist I use in this paper is Peter, and he was an urban professional in his 30s, and he still remembers the panic he felt before being taken to a quarantine camp, which in Chinese we call it fangcang. He spent an entire afternoon trying to rescue his dog after seeing online posts of pets being sterilized, which is a euphemism of being killed by local authorities. And after making numerous calls, eventually he finds someone, a foreigner, who said their hospital, they have a pet hospital, somehow is still being able to take the dog in. And he finally burst into tears at that moment. And then later on, he reflected to me to say this Shanghai lockdown in 2022 is a collective trauma of our age. And it's very interesting. After I had many conversations with Peter later, he said what made him leave China wasn't really the fear of quarantine centers. It was something deeper. He said it was a realization that the things he sought anchored him: his family, his home, his rare book collection, his professional identity could be taken away overnight. So there were many reasons before he said that I didn't want to leave. There are things I care about, but I think it was this extreme, we can call it neutrally as an experiment, this extreme condition that made him realize a lot of things that used to keep him there could vanish overnight. So the lockdown showed him that autonomy he thought he had was far more fragile than he ever imagined. And of course, Peter was not alone. Many young middle-class urbanites who has built stable lives through education and hard work realized during this, zero COVID draconian policy that they have far less control over their lives. than they ever believed. This moment of rupture is important because quasi-exile does not start with the act of leaving. It starts about this existential feeling of a loss of trust, a loss of control, a loss of predictability, and eventually a loss of home as this emotional and political foundation. So as I mentioned earlier, in migration studies, there are quite a lot of existing terms that we use to capture, maybe a similar condition. So I want to do a little bit of concept differentiation. The reason why I use the term quasi-exile to highlight is this movement that's driven less by direct prosecution and more by accumulated constraints. So as we know, if you are political refugees, then there is the abrupt situation that force you to leave the country, right? In the case of, for example, some Russian journalists leaving their home country is because they insisted on reporting the Ukrainian war, and then, they have to leave their home country in a very short period of time. So the kind of group that I'm describing doesn't fit into that because they haven't really experienced direct prosecution, but it is this anticipated fear and anticipated future that is potentially coming. But another thing that makes quasi-exile as a condition is there's also a feeling that home is no longer viable. And it is a displacement without the vocabulary recognition or legal status of exile. And also it is a desire not so much to belong elsewhere as to unbelong to the home state. So I think that's why, we have lots of existing term on expat, right, exile or diaspora. But I want to say there is something else we can focus on. And it is not exile because people can still physically go home, technically, right? It's like because you decided to leave voluntarily, technically you can still go home, but there are increasingly uncertainty depending on what kind of work you want to do outside of the home state. And many decided intentionally not to seek any version of political asylum so they can keep connection with their home state, or especially a concrete personal reason, right? Families and home and friends. And it's also not diaspora because diaspora, although it's widely used these days in Sinophone media as Li San, but diaspora in migration definition, it actually indicates a long-term multi-generational project of community building and connection to the home state. So I think, especially now we are talking about this in Hong Kong, you all know diaspora in the Hong Kong case is a very heavily used term as well. So there is certain direction diaspora is implying, and I think lots of the creators that I'm talking about probably doesn't really fit into the scholarly definition of diaspora because it has lots of indication about coherent collective identity and stable transnational institutional support. For example, in the literature on Chinese diaspora, Huachao is an important term, right? So it is about home state trying to connect with their maybe not citizens, but culturally oversee migrants to insert certain influence. So I want to emphasize exile as a condition, and I think there is a lot of unsettled, ongoing, ambiguous way of being in the world. And I think that's probably something globally lots of people shared and that moves beyond the case of Chinese context. So quasi-exile in my conceptualization, they're not fully included in host society and not fully cut off from their homeland and also not aiming for permanent integration or return. They live what I call presence in movement. So their life is not anchored in a stable location, but in a continuous negotiation of where they can speak, work, and exist with the least constraints. So one of my interlocutors put it beautifully, quoting Virginia Woolf, and I think many of you probably heard this word quoted many times in the past couple of years, is I am rooted, but I flow. So that really captures the quasi-exile experience perfectly. This idea of both being rooted but flow at the same time. Then it comes to the next question about, what does home means, this whole idea of uprootedness. And what I want to argue, the central feature of quasi-exile is the right to unbelong. First of all, let's talk about home. Home is a really, really heavily loaded term, and it's a very complicated term. In the Chinese context, the home sometimes is really related to the state. We have a Chinese saying called 家国同构. So it's this homophily of family and state, all these lingua franca of country as your motherland or father state, whatever we use, it has a lot of relation to make the state have as this larger figure than your family. So leaving therefore carries emotional and even moral weight. However, for some people, especially feminists and feminists, you will hear that talk quite often as well, right? Women have no country kind of thing. So many people don't identify with this whole idea of home state continuation or this idea of state familial analogy. It actually feels quite oppressive. So for some people, moving away from this narrative feels quite liberating. But then that brings us to another stage of this quasi-exile condition, as this idea of privilege and precarity also coexist and this new condition that these people found themselves in. So the group are described, most of them are well educated. So many of them are in their not early 20s, but maybe late 20s, early 30s, up to maybe early 40s. So they're often well educated, have middle class professions, so they have stable income before, which also means for many of them, they are giving up a quite secure economic prospect in trade of whatever they were pursuing elsewhere. But in some cases, that also makes them somewhat privileged in terms of the economic stability that they used to have and the savings they might have. So it's very different from, an early 20 student who moved to Europe and have very little savings. They really need to start their life from scratch. So I think in some cases they're leaving something, giving up something, make them feel this tension of privilege and precarity a bit more strongly. So many of them will. That's why in my conversation with many of them, they will actually use this word of uprooting or 连根拔起. So they will think they're really trying to start a new life and getting rid of whatever they used to have and, try to make something new. But I want to argue what I found really interesting is in this case, different from some of the early migrants, is the destination is not the most important thing. So for many of these people who decided to move, for example, in my case, many of these people moved to Germany or Berlin more specifically, or the Netherlands. It's not because they love Germany as a country or they have, the early narrative American dream, right? You really want to live in this new destination country. It is because you want a certain type of life and that country might provide you the type of life you want. And if we put it more explicitly, it might be certain version of liberal democracy that you think they enjoy. But also, I think with many intellectuals, they're also very critical of what these societies are turning into. And you probably, if you're following politics closely, you also know that the rise of right wing everywhere, right? So there is a certain tension that many of these people, when they're moving, they're also not utterly naive to think, okay, I am moving to a quote unquote free society or whatever. It is more about the potential of what that society can offer. That's why what I think is interesting and important to say in this new age of mobility, we should also really claim the right to unbelong. The right and politics of unbelonging is an emergent theme that I found among quasi-exile subjects. alongside the perception of homemaking and uprooting. Because belonging has long been framed as an aspirational endpoint in migration and diaspora studies, a marker for successful integration, settlement, or national inclusion. Yet, what if belonging is neither the goal nor the desired condition? What if unbelonging is not a failure but a right? In migration governance, legal and social system impose belonging as a normative demand, often structuring it through citizenship, cultural assimilation, or national loyalty. However, for those in condition of quasi-exile, belonging is not always possible, nor is it always desirable, and even be considered a structural violence. So imagine that you live in a country that you want to say, I don't want to be fitting to a specific model while moving to a place that tell you this is the mainstream and you to integrate to the mainstream. That is quite a big joke. So I think for many of the liberal democracy, what they need to realize in the migrant governance is if the core value of your society is freedom, liberty, or whatever that was claimed there, then being a citizen or a person that has right in a society should only fit into those pieces. That should be enough. So that's why I want to point that out about the right to unbelong. So that can echo lots of previous literature. We don't really need to talk about it, but I want to mention Sarah Ahmed because she reminds us that belonging is never neutral. Some bodies are always made to feel out of place. So what is powerful about quasi-exile is that many choose unbelonging. They refuse to be categorized, absorbed, or reduced by either the home state or the host country. So people are not. Another thing that you probably can observe is many of people who move, they don't want to be tokenized as freedom fighters in this narrative of so-called West, right? They also refuse the nationalistic expectation of loyalty from their home country. Then, as I mentioned earlier, the reason what makes them quasi-exile, not exile, is also due to another reason, what I call situational return, is people do want to return because you have emotional ties with specific people, with concrete persons in a home state. So you want to keep the venue open, right? So many do return to the home state for friends, family, a gathering, right? Marriage, funerals, all those essential things that in your life. But every return in this case still feels a bit uncertain. Every crossing for some people might feels like the last crossing. So that's still the quasi-exile part of it because border is quite hard to define, especially I will talk a little bit about that later, depending on what kind of creation or work that you are producing, that there are transnational oppression, right? There's lots of new waves of the authoritarian government moving the borders way beyond its territory. So the situational return is a strategic move, but it's not a promised return. That's why I also think it's interesting. It's very different from, say, the flexible citizenship argument that I think many of you probably have heard of in the 1990s, which is a strategic move between different places, right? We want to be flexible. We want to have foot in both countries. We want to have all these possibilities. While I don't think in current society that is as rosy as it is. So it became a more fragile and risky negotiation among different nation states. But that brought us to a brighter part of this quasi-exile as a condition. So despite all these precarity, I think lots of these quasi-exile can still be profoundly generative because the reason people leave is they want to create certain narrative beyond the state-imposed narrative by any nation states, right? So there is a possibility of trying to create works beyond a nation state framework. So there are quite a lot of new activities that we can observe. For example, the recent opening of quite a lot of Sinophone independent bookstores. Among them, the most notable one probably is Nowhere or Now Here, Fei Di. bookstores. So, but there's more than that. There's many of those stores in different places, right? In Tokyo, Berlin, New York, Hague, right, London, and beyond. And Chiang Mai. So there's many different global sites that we see the emergence of Sinophone independent bookstores. And I always mention that it's not that the bookstore itself is new, it is more the vision, the imaginaries that they trying to channeling through these bookstores are relatively new because, for example, in the US or France or different European countries, there used to be Sinophone bookstores, but the function of those bookstores used to be language teaching or trying to, pass on Chinese culture to your kids. So they sell Confucianism and books of old classics there. While the newer wave of Sinophone independent bookstores, they mainly sell very current works. And in many owners of those bookstores also have the vision of trying to bring different Sinophone literatures together in the same place. So that is the imaginary that doesn't exist, for example, in mainland China, right? You want to put books published by in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in mainland, in Malaysia, right? All these people, as long as they use the Chinese language, they put them together in conversation with each other physically and visually that you can see on the bookshelves. And then they also, create curated Chinese or East Asian or Asian region related content in the local language, for example, English, German, whatever the local language is, to kind of connect this knowledge production and knowledge accumulation process more physically and visually in the cultural space. So this became an emergent scene, and in these different bookstores, they also became cultural spaces. Their events are being held, conversations are happening, and it became, for some people, it became, I feel like, almost like a intellectual place that you want to be immersed in, right? You feel like it is something that you feel belong in a way that visualized in front of you. But then there's also feminist stand-up comedy things rising up in many places. So of course it has a lot to do with censorship because certain contents are more censored within China. So when people move abroad, they want to be able to speak their mind. So and in many places, the more marginalized you are, the more likely you want to do very radical versions of self-expression. So I think now it became a standard stand-up comedian scene, but initially it was started more by feminist stand-up comedy. And then there's also, emergence of this overseas podcast and YouTube channels. I guess many of you probably are consumers and clients of those media venues. And also there are also quite a lot of self-published scenes. That's actually not very specifically to people who move outside of China. It's more something that became quite rich and vibrant during the COVID time because the state at that time was busy with other things, so they don't get to censor lots of locally produced self-published scenes and publication. And then once it was a bit more heavily censored, many of those things became available outside of China. And then there's quite a lot of artist collectives that start emerging. So in a way, I think this emergence of these new space is what Homi Baba might call the third space, right? They are vibrant but decentralized space. They bring together people who share an experience of estrangement, yet do not necessarily identify with one another through ethnicity or nationality. What I think is interesting is really this idea of being decentralized. So there was a running joke in my field work. They said if you moved abroad like 20 or 30 years ago, you might say something like, let's start a new party. That some people might respond positively. Now, if you say something like this, no one will respond to you. It will be a deep silence. So everyone wants to do their own things in a relatively decentralized way. No one really wants to be recognized as a huge group together. I think there's quite a lot of mental gymnastics getting into this response. It might be, different ways. Some might be fair or, trying to be distanced from being called exile, but some might have other idea of just doesn't want to belong to any big group. So talking about this emergence of these new physical space, there's again still this idea of border itself is quite blurring and ambiguous. Because we talk a lot about, this emergent physical space, but lots of these are digital platforms, right? Like if you are a journalist or a filmmaker, whatever, you usually distribute your content still online. So it comes back to this old question of, if you distribute your content through digital platform, then it gives you both a possibility to be present in multiple publics, because you can say, okay, I want to public my content on YouTube, but maybe on WeChat, on Instagram and Substack simultaneously. It gives you a possibility to be everywhere at once. But on the other hand, it also gives authority the possibility to censor you and create surveillance through these contents in everywhere. So even some content creators, they move abroad, if they want to speak to the audience who are still in their home country, then it still need to think about what they want to write about, how they want to frame certain things, whether they want to choose this topic over that topic. So there's still lots of thoughts getting into the minds of these people who move abroad. And eventually, there was always a thing, right, when we talk about the classical exile, there's always this idea once you leave, you became irrelevant. So that there's always this thoughts that everyone is trying to keep pondering whether they make the right choice, especially now we talk about after running from post-COVID China, then it's been quite 2-3 years now, then seems like certain things are getting stable again. So I think for me, the challenge now became whether people will start to move back or they will think, okay, this is the wrong choice. I shouldn't, make this move. Maybe it's better to move to a second tier city in China, blah, blah, blah. So there are lots of different thoughts that I think people are thinking, because when they move abroad, as we mentioned, the uprooting process make life a bit harder for some people. So maybe they will miss the comfortable environment they used to enjoy. Well, this is the interesting thing that I think, this creativity for the group that I'm observing is usually not nostalgic. They're not trying to reconstruct a lost home. They are trying to, find a way of living and creating in the gaps between states, between languages, between systems. So I didn't mention earlier is also you need to think about what language you want to create your content after moving to a different places, right? Do you continue to use your home language? Do you use the local language? Do you try to appeal to this, for example, if we're talking about Chinese case, the Chinese audience abroad, or you try to quote unquote educate the local audience more about the broader China, not the state narrated China? So there's quite a lot of questions are still lingering around, and it makes people keep, pondering their situation. And they're, still in this very multilingual, hybrid, and experimental stage. But usually before Wilhelm Flusser calls exile a breeding ground for creativity, and being in between usually seems to produce new ways of thinking about identity, community, and politics. And digital platforms intensify this dual presence. You can be visible in multiple places at once, as I mentioned, but you cannot fully anchor in any. So it's both, these challenges and opportunities at the same time. So that's what I consider a productive tension of quasi-exile. So let me try to conclude with a few reflections. I think first of all, as I kind of already mentioned quite a few times, the quasi-exile reveals how inadequate our current categories of migration are. It asks us to see mobility not as a binary between voluntary and forced, or between expat and refugees, but something more fluid, emotional, and existential. And also quasi-exile are not simply leaving a place. They're leaving an idea of home without fully arriving elsewhere. So I think that's when I talk about situational return. Although you return to your home state, but this is not the home that you think it used to be, right? Because if you have a specific imaginaries of what my home state is like, then this place has changed. So even you return to the same space, same place, same nation, you think it's no longer your home. So I think that's this whole idea of why home is always a really heavily loaded term. And everything is changing at the same time. There is certain temporalities to this idea of how you imagine your home and how your relationship with the nation state is. And I think this quasi-exile condition is marked by lots of contradiction and privilege and vulnerability, creativity and loss, movement and uncertainty. But it also opens up new possibilities for how we understand belonging and political agency. So in a world of rising authoritarianism, shrinking civic space, and deepening precarity, quasi-exile is becoming an increasingly common human experience, one that invites us to rethink how we study mobility, governance, and identity. So I just think, so this is more on this more theoretical part of how I conceptualize quasi-exile as a condition. Now I want to share a little bit of my new observation from the field. So I have been spending lots of time with these people, or maybe I'm not sure, for sociologists and anthropologists, ethnographers in general, it's always hard to think about your own positionality in the field. I am not so sure whether I will call myself quasi-exile in my own field work. So I try to still call myself an observer and friend of all these people that I engaging with. But I think the whole idea of quasi-exile is always make me a little bit nervous at the same time, because as I mentioned earlier, exile itself is a pretty heavily political term. So I'm not so sure many people that I engage with like to be called quasi-exile because it still has exile in the term. Um, but I still think it's a quite accurate description of what people are going through at this stage of their life. It might change later, but at this stage of their life, I think it is still a pretty accurate description. And one of my key interlocutor recently told me, and she's a journalist, she said when she was applying a grant, she said it was, those journalists in exile kind of version of grant. She said, I think of what you told us, and I decided to apply for this grant nonetheless, because I think my condition might still fitting to that grant. But I think the moment of hesitation is really, what makes quasi-exile interesting, right? Because you cannot really sit well with this term of exile, being in exile. So you're always trying to find where actually my condition is, where I actually stand. Can I apply for this specific grant to facilitate my creation or not? So for me, that's an interesting like episode of my my position in the field. So I told her I was like, control your own narrative, decide where you belong when, especially when you're trying to gather resources to try to finish your work. And there's another episode I recently was thinking through is because in the network of people that I hang around with, sometimes we have visitors, for example, journalists who mainly working in mainland China, for example, in Shanghai, visiting Berlin for a month or so. So she attended quite a lot of those meetings. And at the end of the day, when I met her again in Shanghai, she said everyone looks very miserable. So that makes me feel like, this is again this condition of being in quasi-exile, because she said, when I'm in Shanghai, I still have, great food, friends living nearby. So even with all these oppression, whatever, censorship hanging around there, we all recognize and share this together. While those people that I'm engaging with, they kind of work on their own fight individually, right? Although we gather together quite a lot, but I think their challenges seems to be a bit more individual than, being in a collective. So I think that's another interesting thing I'm still trying to think through. And this third story I want to talk about is actually broadly around the issue of sensitive, or in Chinese we call it 敏感. Because I think this word was raised so many times in my field work, and whether it was outside of China or within China. And I think it's very interesting that how people are having very different understanding of what is allowed and what is not, even when you're outside, when you move away. So my takeaway is almost like the war is within you now. It's like you're constantly trying to think, where is this war? Where is this, war of censorship, war of fire, great firewall? And even when there's a group of people talk together in a relatively closed setting, which is not a public conversation, people are still being quite cautious what they can say and what they cannot say, whether they trust the people in the room or not, because, as I said, border is really a permeate space, that it's not a line, it's not a physical being, right? It's something also moving with us. So I think that's my recent, thoughts on how to kind of think about quasi-exile as a condition, because I think initially when I start to come up with this term, I was already thinking it might not be really related to this movement of leaving. It really has a lot to do with how you feel. That's why I try to always say it is experiential and existential. In a way, I will always trying to think, I'm not so sure what I should push forward this concept to also include people who don't move, but you just remain where you are, but you find yourself also in this quasi-exile condition because you experience the exact same thing that I was, describing, that you're trying to, that the home you believe is no longer there, although you didn't move. So I think for me, I'm still trying to think through how I want to push forward this term, or whether it's nothing if you try to include too many things at the same time. So that's, I think, the lingering thought I'm still having with this term. I think I'll end here, and then we can, have more discussion. Yeah.
This is a fascinating talk, and it's quite informative for many of us, I think, who live in Hong Kong. You see the similar situation has been taking place in Hong Kong too, and how to make sense of this kind of emergent mobility and migration patterns. Sort of a very, very insightful and inspiring. So now I'll open up the floor and invite you guys to ask questions.
Thank you.
Do you need to use this for the online?
Well, for myself, I should speak loud enough, I think. First of all, I find this very innovative, theoretically innovating and inspiring. And second, I was wondering, so probably around 30 years ago, when like the phenomenological anthropology was the thing, this concept of being at home in the world emerged. For example, Michael Jackson, right? His famous quote from that title in this way. And I was wondering, what was your sense when you talked to your research participants? Do they feel, or do some of them feel at home in the world? Which I guess in my understanding would be having a sense of safety or security within yourself. So then wherever you are, you should feel at home, especially considering these conditions of internalized or embodied censorship, as you just mentioned. I'm curious to know.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I actually wrote about this in my paper that Wang Gengwu has a similar thought, but he was, I think many of the audience probably know, he wrote a autobiography, and he provoked, I think it's his wife actually provoked this idea of 苏轼 called 五心安处是吾乡. It's like, I am at home, wherever my heart is, kind of settled kind of thing. So for me, I think many people are trying to achieve that state. And that's why when we say at presence, movement at presence is also this idea of, trying to achieve a sense of, I think it's also similar to the Virginia Woolf quote, right? I'm looted, but I flow. But I'm not so sure many people has achieved that, as you talked about this constant fear and concerns about uncertainty, about censorship, right? But in that sense, I think, especially existentially, I'm not sure anyone can feel that much at home everywhere. So I feel like that's probably a new theme of our current age that we need to think about, how to be able to feel at home at any place, right?
Any other questions from the audience?
I thank you for a very insightful talk. I have a few questions. I'll stick with one. Yeah, you mentioned language briefly. And so I wonder about the language choices. If there's investments in learning the mother tongue of the adopted country or not, and if that reflects on some kind of rootedness or not, and what are the prospects of the future for the children? Are they going to be teaching local varieties to their children or not? Do they see them fitting in back? If they were to go back home, whatever home is, yeah, to the origin, to the region of origin.
No, thank you so much for raising this question, because I forgot to mention this part more extensively. As I mentioned, it's still an ongoing forward, so I cannot give you a specific number, but I think there is a pattern and it's a spectrum, and it's very radically different. There are certain people who intentionally decided to not learn the new language, to not learn the language of the destination country, because I guess there are certain attachments to where they live. They want to be able to do Sinophone, but they also speak English in many cases. So maybe it's enough for them to move around in the new nation, in a new place they found themselves in, or they feel like the language itself of the settled country is a new wave of oppression or violence that they need to encounter. So this is probably a manifestation of this whole idea of right to unbelong. However, there are different versions of this. That's why I said there's a spectrum. There's also people who want to embrace this identity of being a migrant in this new country. So they also try to learn the language and and it's also a bit harder for them because they are in their, early 30s or late 30s. So it's a little bit different from learning a new language when you're in your early 20s. But I think there are people who are trying really hard to learn new language. And interestingly, because for example, if you're in Germany, when you go to this cheaper language center, you're very likely to be learning these language with other refugees. And so some of them, it's a very humbling process for some of them. They will realize, okay, I am going through a very, very similar process as other refugees or asylum seekers. So I should be really embracing that identity this is our shared lived experience now. So there are there are a group of people who are a bit like that. And when you're talking about children, there are also very extreme case of these people who decided to not speak Chinese to their children. So so that's, a very extreme case, but it's like the decision of trying to cut ties was their home state. So they will speak, the other languages that they master at home. So their kids don't learn Chinese at all but will learn the language of this new destination country, or maybe English, which they consider a more global language. So there are different strategies, which for me, it is this really manifest how quasi-exile is a condition, because it is not a set pattern, but everyone has very specific choice why they do what they do, right? It is about how they decide they want to exist in this society, and they made a very particularly different choice. For example, in the German case, I even have an interlocutor who decided to learn Arabic. So that's, to connect with other marginalized people in the country. So there are very, very, very different choices.
And do they live in a district of Berlin, say, that has a lot of Arabic speakers?
Yeah, like Kreuzberg or Neukölln, so it's like lots of migrants live in those neighborhoods. Yeah.
Maybe.
Any other questions?
And you say catch up on the share post.
Oh, yeah,
Shall we, let's see.
yeah, we did later, maybe. Yes, thank you. Yes, this is also my first time to listen to your research so comprehensively. So I also feel it's very touching presentation. And actually, I also have some questions to ask. Based on just my thinking last week. The first one is like we mentioned quasi-exile as a condition. So as I understand, like many people come to European countries through some visa, but they have a limited time. And like 3 years, 4, 5 years. Like so for me, like it's just a temporary living. So they're not quite still assured they can really live here for how long. So I'm also thinking like in such a temporary living, not be a temporary living from your nation, your state on state, like how much they want to devote to build a new life in this temporary new life. And like what is their aspiration and imagination for the new life in such a temporary living condition for me as I think. So the basic question is like, are they really devoted to build a new life in the local places, or they just expect, okay, I will be returned someday, so I don't need really to build my new life here with the local places. So I will return someday. So I'm just curious about this, how they're going to try with their new life. And also another question is about like you mentioned also another kind of migration as people go to America to pursue their American dream. This is more like financial calculation because I can have a better job opportunities in this country and have a better life here. As I understand for your interlocutors, and like they believe also with some value-based immigration, like in the Germany or some other European countries, that they are attracted by these values. But I think is that also a career-driven migration, like because they are not able to do their original work in China anymore, so they want to move to another country to have more freedom, more spaces to do that. But actually, they feel like they still need to come back because their audience maybe still in their home country, and then so I'm also thinking like if they're the draft or the very original reason for this movement is still some career-driven reasons, or just some general ideas of a better life. Because if you just want to have a better life, you can do so many different jobs, but still insist in doing their original job somehow, not really change to a very different industrial thing. So just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, this is two very good questions. So the first question, it's actually it's quite important. Although I try to not talk about the legal status too much, but one of my major fields at Berlin is actually there's a legal reason why it's one of the major choice for these people is because Berlin has a freelancing visa program, and it's Berlin specific. It's not the whole Germany. It's really you have to be registered at Berlin's Ausländerbehörde, their foreign affairs office. So it is true it's a limited thing, but it's also true that it's a place that attracts lots of people like that. And then within this group of people who apply for this freelancing visa, people have different approach to it. Some people decided, because usually you are granted 3 year of visa on this 3 year time of stay based on this visa or resident permit, right? Visa is just the stamp itself. So usually you were granted 3 year of time. Some people decided they just want to spend 3 years in this place. So it's almost like, I just want to breathe for a little bit and see what's going to happen next. But for some people, it's just a getaway thing, right? And they really decided to settle in this society. So they learn a language, they try to, some of them buy apartment, right? So they really try to settle in this new society. And you probably know that usually depending on your own qualifications, 3 to 5 years, you can get a permanent residency in Germany. So it is a relatively friendly program for newly migrated people at this point. That's also why these people choose Germany as a destination country, despite the language differences, right? Because German is not the easiest language to learn as well. So I think that's a really good question. So lots of them did devote time to build a new life, and they didn't imagine going back to China after 3 years. And also, there are political economic reasons why you don't imagine that. You can probably foreseeably things are not going to change so quickly in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. So there are also very practical concerns that people have in their mind about whether they want to start a new life there. And I forgot to mention the language question earlier. Actually, most of them don't really want to have kids. So that's another thing. So when it comes to children's education, it's not a major concern because you usually don't really think about, and you all know this last generation idea, right? And it is also a concept in Germany actually, but for a different reason, for climate change reason. So this is also, I think usually they think about themselves. So it's not so hard to imagine yourself to start a new life in this society for a relatively longer point of view. But for practical reasons, some of them who decided to stay a shorter term, they might have different strategies in terms of earning, paying taxes, and all these things. Because when they work globally, then they have different ideas of whether they want to work, for example, more collaborated with German institution, or you try to collaborate with different other institution, which will give you less proof that you are actually making earning in Germany. So there are lots of strategic concerns when people have decided whether they want to extend their visa and whether they really want to settle in that society. And I think the second question regarding whether it's a career-driven migration is also a really good one. But usually I would still think they're more value-driven. It's mainly because many of them, it's very hard for them to work as a journalist outside of, not outside of China, just when they go into a new place. So for them, it's actually harder to move to this new place. If they remain in where they used to be, they can continue to work whatever they work, given all the challenges that they already know. So for them, economically, it is a downgrade. Usually you give up a stable job. But if you talk about switching career paths within the home state, and then many of them, it goes back to this act of leaving, right? The reason why they want to leave is because they feel so suffocating in the society that they're trying to leave. So it doesn't matter whatever they're doing, as long as they're living in that society, they have that existential feeling or experiential feeling of, very, basically it's very hard to breathe. I think that's actually lots of people talk about this idea of, having a mental space to think and breathe. So that's why I still think it's more value-based migration. And the career part, I think, is collectively why there's emergent community now, because people want to talk about how they can work when they move outside, and who they should work for, what media they can collaborate with, what funding they can apply for, who can pay for their living costs, right? So these are all really hard question and very essential, because essentially you still need to try to at least have some economic income so you can sustain yourself. And that comes back to your question of switching career, actually, because they really want to settle in this place that they're moving to. some of them do think about whether they should, for example, go to vocational training to become a blue collar worker in this new setting. So I think the extreme case, for example, Peter, when I first talked to him, but again, people's mind change. When I first talked to Peter, right after 2022, the Shanghai lockdown, he said he'd rather to become a bus driver outside than, you know, stay there and having his stable income. But of course, he didn't become a bus driver at this point. He actually started to do more what he used to do, media related work. So I think what you believe in when you leave and what this story keep evolving is also quite different. Yeah.
For the presentation is very interesting. So just out of curiosity, since you mentioned the COVID in your title, and I was thinking, is that the criteria for you how to select your participants, that you purposely selected your interlocutors who move into a new country after the COVID? And yeah, and I also knew some of my friends who moved to a new country in the recent years. Just I think it just within the 2 years, like moved to Canada and to US. And I was wondering how much is the COVID makes the difference here? What is the difference like for the reasons that they move into a new country after the COVID and before the COVID? How much is the COVID makes things happen?
Yeah, that's a very good question because I think the COVID factor, in a way, I need to think whether it's a more China specific thing because China has this very specific draconian zero COVID policy, right? So in that case, that's why for all these people that they experience a version or they see other people experience a version of control that they feel very personal. And I think on the side of political economy is also due to this all the COVID policies, lots of small businesses dying. And so it has something to do with how the economy is turning into at this stage. So for me, this is still a very strong factor to see why people move, because lots of people move right after that time, or they start to thinking about moving around that time. And then it happened 1 or 2 years after, you know, everything was lifted up, blah, 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 right? So I still think in a way, it's a COVID factor, but I still need to think whether it's a China specific COVID factor or it is a global COVID factor. That's something I will, you know, think more about. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Just a quick question, also building up on your question. So I think the pandemic has highlighted or maybe intensified interest in psychology or psychological language in China. This is sort of thing I'm interested in as an anthropologist. And in Euro-American psychological frameworks, this perpetual uprootedness, not feeling at home anywhere is often linked to trauma. It's called
Totally.
And the way you related your interlocutors narratives to us, it seems they use a lot of existential language, maybe philosophical even. But I do wonder if they ever refer to these psychological frameworks. And one very short question, just a detail. Use the name Peter, which is obviously not a Chinese name, and I'm wondering if that's a deliberate choice that you stick to, or is this your interlocutor's choice? I wonder why.
Okay. So the first psychological effect, I don't think they talk about it too much. But apart from the collective trauma of our age, that is actually, so people use, so in a way, maybe yes, they will say PTSD, right? So in
They
that,
say like trauma.
yeah, they will say PTSD. They will just use this word PTSD, right? Like, yeah, so it's just because especially people who has really experienced an intensive version of lockdown, it was really, I think personally, I also experienced that like a year after that. I didn't realize how strongly it is because it's really embodied feelings, right? For example, I always tell people after being locked in Shanghai, and then a year later, when I was walking on the street, everything reminds me of a year ago, right? It's like, oh, the flower is open. I remember last year when, you know, tulip is open, I was about to enter the lockdown. And then I see sakura open. I was like, last year I didn't see the cherry blossom because I was indoor. So this like everything, the scent in the air reminds you of what you happened. So I think in that sense, that version of PTSD, people mentioned it. And I met many people a year or 2 years later when we talk about this, it's everything. And actually, I think the first time I met Yang, we were also talking about this, right? It's like you don't talk about anything. You talk about the trauma experience during the lockdown for a straight several hours before we entered other more substantial conversations. So I think that is definitely a thing. But what remain a puzzle for me now is how sustaining or how influential it is now. For example, 3 years later, 4 years later, how strong that is, or does that, because some people will say trauma stays with you forever. So I don't know how sustaining that is. And I'm curious to, you know, keep observing that. The Peter question is a really good one. I think I just didn't give it too much thought because this interlocutor also has a quite generic name in Chinese. So I try to use the name that sounds a bit more generic as well. Yeah, I just think I want to make it more anonymous for him.
It
But
would be interesting to ask. You can.
yeah, I will ask
People
him.
you talk to,
Yeah.
really prefer.
Yeah,
Western
next
or
time I will.
Because I think that is also a piece of information.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll actually ask him whether how he feel about this, because in my previous work, when I write about Chinese students who are sent abroad during high school, I use the same. I match whether if they told me their English name, I will use a pseudonym in English. If they tell me their name in Pinyin, then I will create a Chinese name for them. So this time I didn't think too much about this. Yeah. Yeah, shall we do the online question? Yeah. So it should be this one, right? What I found particularly interesting is that in recent years, a formally similar phenomenon run has emerged even in countries traditionally seen as immigration destination. Yeah, that's actually what I meant. Google search for moving to Canada search more recently, we see American conservative and anti-woke ideological immigrants choosing to immigrate to countries like Russia, which upholding Christian Orthodox value, opposing Western woke politics, and are engaging in various homemaking practice blogs and TikTok. This leads to two questions. One, when we frame one as quasi-exiles, it's still necessary to accurate to place it strictly within an authoritarian liberal binary framework. Two, how should we understand this reverse direction of run I described, and what does it imply about the concept applicability beyond post-COVID China? Yeah, this is really interesting. I think the first when you mentioned Trump, people moving from Canada, Trump America to Canada, it's exactly what I described. That's why I use authoritarian context, because you know US can be an authoritarian context as well under Trump. But this other direction is a bit different. I think I need to think whether it's called quasi-exile, because by definition, if you don't feel at home at where you are, and it's not ideological, so it is in some way also value driven, and probably also fitting to what I'm trying to describe here. This reverse direction, I guess we don't even need to call it a reverse direction, right? Because there is no, it's not like this is the right direction, that's the wrong direction. What is implied about concept? Yeah, but I think I need to think as I mentioned earlier, I need to think about how generative a concept should be. For example, whether it should include people moving from this, you know, from US to Russia, or whether I should include people who didn't move, but also feel quasi-exile when they stay where they are. So I think this is a good question for me to keep thinking, how far should we push these concepts? Yeah.
We have another,
Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you for all the wonderful discussions. So I'm a psychology student, so might be a naive audience here. So my question here is about the curious travel experience of your participants. So I'm quite curious about whether they have the previous like living history in another country, or they always just live in China or their home country, and this is the first time they have ever moved to another country. Because I'm always thinking about whether this value-based immigration is based on their previous experience or just based on their imagination. Are they really know what they're committed to a new life or in another country, or they already have some existing previous living experience, so they know what they commit to the new life over there. So that's my question.
That's actually quite interesting. I never thought about it through this angle, but when I'm thinking about the interlocutors that I engage with, they actually all have quite a lot of previous travel experience. So I think for them, this move does has an idea of trying to keep your lifestyle in a way, right? It's like I used to be able to move globally, now I don't. So I want to move to somewhere I still can move globally. Because actually it was Peter also. Yeah, so it was quite extreme when he said this to me. Remember, that was him in 2022, not now. But when he said it to me, he's like, if I want to choose a side between China and the world, I want to choose the world. That's the exact words he told me at that time. I mean, he's not gonna say that again now. But I think that sentiment is that they used to, and I think for me, I also need to think about whether there are certain things that's more generational about it, because we all know there is quite a lot of people grown up with this idea of being global citizen, the possibility of cosmopolitanism, the idea of, I can connect with everywhere. There's more optimism, right? And I think there are generations now growing up who don't believe in that kind of imaginary. So I think imaginaries are still important, but it's a different direction. It is about whether it's important to be connected to the world or not. So these people that I'm describing, they definitely will vote for, I want to be constantly connected to the broader world, rather than be limited to a specific nation state, because you will find people who will say, I've grown up in a great country and this is the best place in the world. I don't want to go to anywhere else. So that's another, competing narrative you might find some people believe in these days. However, it's also interesting. My previous research on the, on Chinese students going to America for private high schools, they usually don't have that experience. So it's purely based on imaginary. It's based on how US is the #1 global power. Again, thinking about this is really almost now it's a historical work because people don't believe in that anymore, right? So it was that I mentioned this previous research just trying to say how people's imaginaries change and how this historical belief in a way feeding to their choices and the patterns and phenomena that we are observing these days.
any other questions? If there is no questions, I'll ask. Yeah, I'll take the advantage to ask a few questions. Actually, I feel like I have a lot of questions to ask Cici, but it's quite challenging to put my thoughts together. So forgive me, I'm just rambling. So, my first question is about actually, the value in the process, because you mentioned it's the value driven migration. So I'm just curious, do you think that if they share the value, that drives them to sort of running away from their home country, or there also might be the possibility where the kind of entanglement between place and value has become dismantled. So they might have different values and they might have have struggles, about figuring out their attachment, their values. So people who actually migrate to Berlin, they have different values. So I'm asking this because I'm thinking in your presentation, I get different impressions sometimes. Sometimes I feel like there's intensified or highly criticized discussion among these people. What kind of value we will, or I think there was this question, from the chat box, right? It's Trump, America, it's highly political issue. And for people to move to Russia, it's also a highly political, it's a political sensitive issue, and also a very hard, it's a very kind of a value-driven decision. So there seems to me there's possible and intensified geopolitical entanglement involved in this process. But also in your presentation, you also mentioned this is such a decentralized, very diversified sort of a profile of these people. So I also get a sense this value can be very diversified. There might be a new room for discussion of different values, maybe new values will emerge. So I'm just kind of would like, maybe you can clarify a little bit on how what are these values? How to sort of make sense of these values?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky question to answer. I still think there are certain shared values, but it's not in terms of, for example, ideological values. It is more about its values in believing in an open society, believing in the existence of civil space is important, believing in the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, those kind of, shared values. But when you talk about, then it comes to the second question. We have been talking about in person before, right? I said there's lots of divisions on specifically when there's issue-oriented or identity politics wise, people have different thoughts on it. And I think that's why it became a more decentralized and diversified space. And everyone can find their own space, their own community, their own, people that they want to hang around with. So I feel like this exact tension is why I feel like they're different than the traditional exile. Because if you're a traditional exile, you're against the exact same thing, right? Then you're forced by a specific thing. But now I think it's more like you aspire to a certain thing, but then you approach it from very different spaces. So in some places it became intensified and politicized. In other places you want to distance yourself from being politicized or, being tokenized as this political fighters or whatever. So I think this tension is actually a very tricky thing that I'm trying to capture in the field. For example, lots of these people, they might be, especially when we're talking about moving to a quote unquote Western society, then people will say, oh, these people flee, blah, 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 so they're come to here. Most of them will be very strongly against that narrative. So they will try very hard to distance themselves from that narrative because they don't want to be tokenized as that thing. They want to be themselves, and some of them might just want to be a helmet and in their own space and no one talks to them anymore. So there are different ways, and that's why I think the decentralizing part of it is very important. Yeah.
I'm sorry, they brought up a question in my mind. So yeah, that brought up a question. I mean, you distanced them from diaspora, and you very clearly did that. But I wonder about diaspora consciousness. Does that apply here? I mean, it seems that they have, a foot in various worlds. So they might see things in a similar way. Just curious.
I think, yeah, that's still, I think, a very important. I think the reason why I try to distance it from diaspora is too huge, too broad, and everyone is trying to, use diaspora to capture it. And I think there are certain specificity of it that need to be distanced from diaspora. But of course, I think you also cannot refute the idea that they're migrants, right? So for me, this is the thing that you have diaspora consciousness, you have shared migration experience. So there is all these comes to this idea of everyone talk about all being a migrant. It's very important to think about food, right? How you still value your food very importantly, blah blah blah. I think in that sense, it's really the old diaspora consciousness that everyone shares about, right? This whole idea of home is so far away that really want to still be connected to home. I think that emotional part and cultural part is still quite strong. And I think that's why people still struggles quite a lot in what language should I creating, what content should I creating, who should I write for, who should I speak to, right? These are still the same questions that all diaspora and all the diaspora conscious probably will be connected to. I think for them, the newer part is really this whole idea of, but I don't really want to belong to this space, right? I don't really want to speak that specific language. So these for me are relatively new, and all the culture spaces that they're creating for me is a bit new, because it is more about create a new search space. It's not either here or there. It's trying to create something beyond the old framework of nation states, all these older things. For me, that's the interesting and productive part of this. Yeah.
Yes, in the discussion also we bring a lot of thoughts to the So I also have another question also going back to Jess. And we just mentioned about it is a quite a value existed migration. And I'm just quite interested in like what is the exact moment people make the decision that they want to leave? Like you mentioned time point in the title that is close to COVID-19. But I like I don't know whether you really talk this much with your interlocutors, like what is the exact moment they feel like they cannot bear it anymore, they must leave. And like it is a value thing. I mean, I don't like the social atmosphere, but I somehow still can bear it. Yeah, I can still live there. It's not really that we cannot live anymore here. But what is the exact moment they feel like I cannot bear anymore, I must leave? So I don't know whether like the interlocutors of you will also have something in common, like say somehow influenced by some same points, like triggered their decision to leave. And is that really a value thing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I actually asked them, and I think I already mentioned that in Peter's case, the exact moment is really not a functional experience itself, but it's this experience of thinking through what are things that keep me here. So he actually mentioned several things to me in that conversation. He said, "Oh, I used to think about moving elsewhere, before COVID. It's thoughts that he entertained with from time to time in the past as well. But during COVID, not COVID, during this whole lockdown thing, he asked himself, what are the things that keep me here? And he said, oh, it's this, family, grandparents, right, who cannot move. But he said, during lockdown, I cannot see them who just live in the next compound to me, but I cannot see them anyway. He said, okay, another thing is the books that I collected through different venues from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from all these countries that I traveled to. It's very hard to get all these books. So these are the physical belongings that I really don't want to let go. But then he said people can, during this lockdown time, the sanitary team can break into my room and, all of these things can be destroyed anyway. So he really runs through everything he think that keeps him there to me. I think he listed 3 or 4 things to me. And then at the end, he said, but all these things, I don't have access to them during this extreme case. That's the moment I realized I really shouldn't live here anymore. So I think many of the people that I talk to have a similar, not everyone's like him have this exact moment, but they have this similar experiential moment of I cannot live here anymore. This is suffocating for me. And for example, another interlocutor that I talked to quite a lot, I think it was also his job is bearable, but he really, when he moved abroad for visiting thing for quite a while, he feel like, okay, now I think that's why I mentioned earlier, I can breathe again. I think that's really a very existential moment. Lots of them, they will say, I really cannot breathe when I'm here, but then it's almost like a magic moment that I feel like I can breathe again. So I decided that's where I want to be. But again, they also don't want people to misunderstood this idea of I can breathe again to as a token to say, oh, this is, I think many of them, if you probably remember many years ago, there was a Chinese girl making a graduation speech in one of the American university, and she talks about the air of freedom or something. It gets quite a lot of backlash. So I think for them, it's definitely not that. They really want to avoid being used to say, oh, I'm like trying to now breathe the free air of freedom in a different place. But it is also a reality that the moment when they move to another society, they feel like, okay, I can breathe again, that I have my mental space coming back to me again. So I think that's the tricky part of the moment of leaving, because for them it is and I think that's why many of these people are cultural workers, because if you do work in other industries, you also feel suffocating. But then maybe you're like, oh, that's fine. I will try to, just bear it, and there's gonna be another day. Everywhere is bad, blah blah blah, right? Then eventually you can stay. And I think that's why when I first talked to Peter, I already said I think many people, they feel really bad in 2022, but most of them not going to move. And then I found there are a bunch of them who actually move. That's why I'm interested in these people who actually decided to move. And I know these people did give up certain comfortable life. They leave those life behind and actually start a little bit difficult life abroad in the initial stage. So I'm interested in how they're, living their life and whether they're creating something new. And I think the next challenge probably is when the discrepancy doesn't seem to be as big as it was before, whether they're going to make new choices. Yeah.
Yeah, just a final comments maybe, because what you just said reminded me of some of my friends, right? They are not culture workers, but they are sort of scholars, professors. They actually exactly go back to China
Mm-hmm.
after COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
They thought it might be easier for them to achieve something
Mm-hmm.
in China. So for them, the knowledge production, the intellectual work is still visible in China. So I'm just finding it's quite interesting if you look at these two different types of people. Because what you mentioned, right, that the Berlin visa is for freelancers, right? So for these scholars, right, most of them work in universities, which is a highly secured institution. So I think that dimension, if we think about how cultural production, knowledge production has fit into this picture, it's quite interesting. Just a final comment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting comment. And also I feel like that's why institution is a really important factor in this, right? Because the people that I work with or I engage with, they basically are distancing themselves from institutions, right? But what you're talking about is almost people trying to, I don't want to say take advantage, but trying to at least utilize the resources of institution, and how much resources are at your disposal does has a lot to do with the ongoing geopolitical dynamics, right? Whether at a certain historical moment, which institution strategically might provide certain person the best resources might be a different conversation. But for me, that's also how industries are different, right? That's why lots of these people I study, I focus on their journalists. So their industry is very, very different from the academic institutions. Some people might even argue that, okay, now maybe in mainland China, you really need to go to scholars to see what's going on because we write slowly, we don't get publicized so much. So maybe you will still be able to do whatever you're, doing, because otherwise, especially for some foreign scholars who are interested in studying China, maybe they will never be able to enter the country again. So there's like lots of strategic move that I think people are taking into consideration. And but in my observation, I think there is a genuine distance or mistrust on any institution from at least the freelancing artists, journalists, content producers, communities at this point. But that also makes the life itself more precarious because you will not be able to have a full-time stable job if you're not part of an institution.
Thank you so much, since Robert is. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Sunny, for talking us. That was just fun. Do we have an announcement for next activity or else?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Here is the procedure of confirmation attendance, and one more is we have another monthly seminar.
Here, just to show up with the.
I want to listen to this.
Thank you. Please join us.
Yeah.
We will promote it in the following weeks.
If you're interested, welcome to join our seminar again. Thank you so much. Thank you.